This is the LatinNews Podcast. I am your host, Richard McCall, here in Bogota, Colombia. Our very special guest has just returned from the island of Cuba, and we are very honored to be speaking to Dr. Jorge Domínguez, who is a retired Harvard professor and, of course, expert on all things to do with Cuba and Mexico indeed. But Cuba is the topic today, and I know you arrived yesterday, Jorge. Tell us about your impressions of what's going on.
Well, let's start with the trip. One of the things that has been reported in the press is about airlines not being able to fly to Cuba because they have enough fuel. As it turns out, I flew on American Airlines from Miami to Havana and from Havana back to Miami, because American Airlines for quite some time has carried its fuel for the return trip. In fact, the trip was entirely normal. There was nothing unusual. If I had not read the press about this not happening, I would not have gone. No big deal. When I landed there at the same time, an Air France, a large plane, had landed as well from Paris. And they had discovered that by making a fuel stop along the way and on the way back to Paris, they could do it just as well. The surprise to me is that Air Canada decided to suspend its flights without doing what Iberia, Air France, and others are doing. So it's an interesting, there is a news phenomenon that is very alarming. Then there is a practical set of circumstances that are either normal, American Airlines from Miami and return, or are adjusted, Air France from Paris, but now stopping somewhere. So that is about the trip. It was a very interesting several days. I've been to Cuba pretty much every year for the last 35 or so. I was born in Cuba, but I've lived in the United States most of my life. So let me describe walking down the street, because I think it's the easiest way to get at several issues. You look down the street and there's not much traffic. There just is not much traffic. Now, Havana, compared to Bogota, compared to New York City, compared to almost any other capital city, has not had much traffic for a long time. It's not news that it has limited traffic. But there is much less than there was a year ago, when my last visit was a year ago from December. You do see motorbikes now that are electric motorbikes. And one of the ways they're adjusting is to have these, and many of them function as taxis. So you have, someone jumping on the back and the like. So that's a small adjustment. But basically, not much traffic. I tried to spend my days as residents of Havana ordinarily do. And when without a car and with really not functioning public transportation for the most part, very few regular buses, I walk. And I averaged about 10 kilometers per day, roughly 6.5 miles per day. I'm accustomed to walking. I like to walk. It's my preferred exercise. But I can tell you that doing that every day was a little burdensome, and it has to be burdensome for the people of Havana and other smaller cities. Walking down the street, the first things you don't see very much, therefore, is vehicles. Especially not cars. You do see motorbikes. You do see some trucks. Second thing you do not see when you look down the street is tanks, personnel carriers, military equipment. An image of Cuba is that it is an authoritarian regime, and it is. It is a single-party regime. On National Election Day for the National Assembly, the number of candidates equals the number of seats. That's a politician's dream, but it's not my idea of democratic politics. The government really does try to control information, now less successfully because of social media, but it is an authoritarian regime. So it is a little bit of a puzzle. That is an authoritarian regime that seems to have not the consent of the governed, but at least the acceptance of the governed. And this is one of the, to me, has been for a long time an interesting issue to try to think about Cuba. There's a lot in Cuba that is working very badly, has been working badly for quite some time. Much of it is the responsibility of its government. But there is a sense among the population that this is preferable to alternatives they might envisage. And so there's public order. The only instance I saw in my several days there of an officer of the law, a police officer, exercising law enforcement power, was giving a traffic ticket to an electric bike where there were two people who were speeding irresponsibly. At the end of there was also a conversation, not just the ticket, and at the end of the ticketing, they shook hands. You know, even nice cops do not always do that.
No.
The third thing that this one you do see down the street, I walked down just on one street so that I could really take it in. Dilapidated buildings. It isn't just that the buildings are, some of them have fallen down, some of them are badly decrepit, but that there's still people living there because they do not have an alternative place to go to. The risk to their lives is extraordinary. Walking down the street and other things that you see is potholes everywhere. So there is the interesting relationship between no cars and too many potholes. If there were cars, the cars would be in terrible shape. I had to walk on the street with the potholes because it was a little less unsafe than walking on the sidewalks that had pretty much fallen apart. So it's every few steps and almost on every street corner, there's a gigantic pile of uncollected trash. And for a country that had prided itself correctly for many, many years on public health provisions, this is the antithesis of your idea, of any listener or viewer idea of public health. So it looks as if this is a disaster that is unfolding, and it may indeed unfold and be even more of a disaster. But I also saw several tables of 4 people playing dominoes. I saw a set of boys with what seemed to be a bat and a ball trying to play baseball. The particular street I'm telling you about was on Saturday, Valentine's Day. And so, just let's both of us hold in mind the image I've described of the street. There were some women elegantly dressed, ready to go celebrate Valentine's Day. I wonder where they got the clothes. Maybe they sewed them themselves. In any event, you get, what I'm trying to say, Richard, is you get the image of normal life, even though everything is falling apart. There is the name, the title, Love Among the Ruins. Well, this was love among the ruins of a city. These were men and women about to celebrate Valentine's Day. Finally, not finally. So I did not see a crushed people. I see a people with extreme hardship, but their spirits were, hey, we're going to make it. We're even going to have a party tonight. Other thing, and one of the last thing on this description, on the looking down the street, there were lots of people my age, elderly. There was a bunch of kids playing baseball and so on. There were few people, I'd say, ages between 25 and 55. And this is a big population story. In the last, from between 2020 and 2025, Cuba lost about 1.4 million people. A lot of those were labor force aged individuals. And many of them left because of the COVID pandemic. Many of them left following the nationwide street protest of July 2021, and many just left because they couldn't take it. This is at least as much a catastrophe as anything else, because a country without its working age men and women is a country that is bound to be in trouble. End of description of the street.
But a perfect description to tell us what is happening, let's say, on the surface there, and things that we don't see ourselves beyond the headlines in the press. We get reports talking about the collapsed economy and, of course, a humanitarian crisis beyond imagination. But what I'm hearing is obviously extreme hardship, no surrender of sorts from the Cuban people, but a majorly contracting economy and a grinding strategy being levied by the United States towards the island. We have to start thinking about, will this economy collapse then? I mean, is this too premature to say?
So I think you characterized it. This is clear hardship. It has gotten worse, as I compare this visit to previous visits. There were moments when I thought that garbage was being collected a little more frequently than it was a year ago, but I'm not sure that I could even affirm that. So it is real trouble. The important disconnect when I listen to headlines or read social media and the like is the assumption that this economic hardship will lead to the collapse of the state. And that is not happening yet. That happened, I don't know. It's important to remember that this is at least the third time since revolutionary victory in 1959 that Cuba has gone through very severe hardship. The first time was the late 1960s, when they had bad relations with the United States, with the Soviet Union, and with the People's Republic of China. The second time was the early 1990s, that the Cuban government calls the special period, when the Soviet Union had collapsed and their other communist regimes in Europe had collapsed, and they made it through. And part of what certainly the Cuban leadership thinks, whether ordinary Cubans do think this or not, it's very hard to say. But the Cuban leadership says, hey, we're going to do it. The police officer that I described a moment ago doing his duty on the street is an example of that. The government system of trying to reallocate the use of fuel to make sure that tourist buses are functioning, because they need tourist dollars and euros to make the economy work, and passing on the adjustment to ordinary people who, like me, at least for those few days, have to walk, therefore. I mean, that is the state actually adjusting. The Cuban state has been terrible at generating prosperity. Really terrible. It has been amazingly effective at managing hardship. The best example of managing hardship is coping with hurricanes. Very few lives are lost in Cuba when a horrendous hurricane hits. Often fewer than when that same hurricane hits Puerto Rico, which is, after all, a U.S. territory, or Louisiana, Hurricane Katrina, a number of years ago. It is a state that is almost geared to say, the worst is happening. That's what we step forward and can do it. Can they pull it off this time? I don't know. But the easy line that goes from economic hardship to state collapse, not yet.
It's at this moment in time, then, despite, again, the crisis, a blockade on oil and other goods, the state so far is rising to this challenge.
Yes,
so far.
Yes, it is so far.
So far. And
will it have the wherewithal to continue? I don't know. By the way, you just used the word blockade. That word is
it's weighted, isn't it? It's weighted. We've got to be careful with this word.
Often contentious. Historically, I've used the word blockade of Cuba for only one event, the 1962 missile crisis.
Okay.
It clearly was a blockade. But I think now it finally is again a blockade. There is a news story today in the New York Times using satellites and the like that indicates that a tanker that left with Colombian fuel was intercepted, prevented from going to Cuba, and taken to the Bahamas. That is a blockade.
Yeah.
That's not an embargo. That's not economic sanctions. That's not threatening tariffs. That is a blockade.
Yes, I too have read that piece, and of course I was thinking of the difference between, was it the Kennedy era when they called it a quarantine, and now because it is a blockade. I think the semantics of it.
It seems to be limited to fuel. Food products can go,
Okay.
at least in part because U.S. agricultural producers last year, Donald Trump's full year in office, U.S. agricultural producers exported over $700 million to Cuba. And so if you blockaded agriculture, you are blockading Kansas and Iowa and Nebraska. And Donald Trump does not want to do that.
No, of course. I mean, it's such a fascinating situation. I mean, Cuba, obviously, we don't need to explain all of the history. It's so present for all of us in this business. But this is a 67-year-old regime. You talk about this as being the third occasion of these challenges, and of course a blockade. When we come back to that term again, it suggests that Cuba presents an actual sort of threat to the United States, but Cuba doesn't, or does it? I mean, what do you know of, let's say, China's expanding intelligence footprint in Cuba? Is it something that the US would desperately want to get rid of in this hemisphere?
So, I mean, what is part of what is puzzling is why this level of coercion. When Cuba is a shadow of what it was during the Cold War. I mean, you and I were having this conversation in 1986, not in 2026. Cuba at that time had approximately 50,000 troops deployed in various African countries, mostly in Angola and in Ethiopia, and smaller military missions elsewhere. Now, was that a threat directly to the United States? No. But was that adversarial to U.S. interests worldwide? Yes. There was an alliance with the Soviet Union, the various sorts of things. At that time, one could describe the kind of rationale that the U.S. government is putting forth now. But now? No. I mean, it is a country in dire straits. Its armed forces have obsolete equipment. So if one reads the presidential executive order that attempts to justify these events, there are references to not bases, but facilities alleged to belong to or be operated by China and Russia. It is almost certain that there is a Chinese facility for signals intelligence somewhere on the outskirts of Havana aimed at the United States. It appears to have been in place since 2019, the first Trump presidency, and continuing during the Biden administration. Now, a facility for signals intelligence, what is it that one needs? Basically, one needs, Richard, you, your equipment, and your room, or me, my equipment, and my room. You do not need tanks. You do not need missiles. You do not need nuclear warheads. What you need is the capacity to listen. And the technology of the world today, certainly the technology of significant power, like China and Russia, allows them to do that. That is, now, put that in context. One goes back, this used to be very common, beginning in the 1960s, when the United States and the Soviet Union reached an agreement on nuclear weapons, on missiles, variety, signed treaties and the like, in all of them, there was usually a clause that says that they would rely to trust each other, not just on the words of the nation's leaders, but on ordinary technical means of verification. That means signals intelligence. That means satellites that have a capacity to capture tiny things on the ground. So the idea that superpowers have this capacity to look at each other, to spy on each other, to spy by the consent of the parties, because what gives them stability, that they're not misbehaving, is that I can see you and you can see me. That's all. And so I believe that there is a Chinese signals facility in Cuba. It doesn't need much. I don't know whether there is a Russian intelligence facility in Cuba, but there very well may be. Chances are that this is one of the ways that Cuba tries to make money, by charging rent to Russia and China. Now, take a different tack. How good are relations between these various countries? Well, Russia has talked a very good game in some sense, embracing the Cuban government and saying, we're with you. No Russian tanker with fuel has appeared in Havana for a while. The most recent documented tanker carrying petroleum came from Mexico about somewhat over a month ago. China has at times financed purchases of petroleum for Cuba, but Chinese-Cuban relations are complicated because Chinese companies that have traded with Cuba or that have invested in Cuba would like to be paid. That's a reasonable expectation if you are a company, whether in the private sector or a state enterprise, and Cuba has not been very good about paying. So whenever Chinese and Cuban government officials get together to talk, one of the issues is a fairly unpleasant discussion that says, you owe me money. When they move off that because they say we're fraternal brothers, we all believe in some of the same values, not altogether true, but true enough. The Chinese then say, your economy really is a mess. It isn't just that there's real hardship, but that you, government officials, have done very little to go down through, I'm going to use a phrase that they use, which is annoying, I know, the correct path. The correct path means, hey, Cuban government officials, do the same thing we, Chinese government officials, have been doing since we abandoned Mao's prescriptions and turned toward a market economy. And we've been doing that since the late 1970s. They don't point to Vietnam directly, but basically it is to say you want to survive as a communist regime in the world today, you need to have a market economy.
Sure.
That's not what the Cuban government has wanted to do. It is what the Cuban government should have done long ago in order to prevent the hardship to its people. It is what the Cuban government may have to do to get out of the terrible circumstances they're in now. But what I'm describing is at the same time a failing of the Cuban government. But why Cuban government officials and Chinese government officials don't play dominoes together? They're really not all that friendly. The Cubans don't like to be lectured by the Chinese. The Cubans would like to say to the Chinese, hey, I know I owe you money, but how about postponing the payment? I'm in a tough spot, give me a hand. I don't want to exaggerate the difference between Chinese and Cuban officials. China, particularly in recent months, has done a very good job at sending equipment for solar panels to Cuba. And in terms of shifting toward renewable energy, this is a very important step. Again, there would be the footnote. I apologize for using the word footnote. There would be the side comment that Cuban leaders living in the middle of the Caribbean could easily look up and see the sun They could easily have figured out a long time ago that solar energy would make sense in Cuba, and that only in the last couple of years have they made a serious push toward solar panels. I'm glad they're doing it, but God, is that what central planning means? Isn't central planning supposed to be the capacity to peer ahead? So what's interesting about the example of solar panels is, yes, they're doing the right thing. Yes, the Chinese are helping them. That, Richard, should have happened a long time ago. So it's a comment on the present and the history at the same time.
So, I have a side comment here. Is it, what would with all of that armada in the Southern Caribbean and in the Caribbean, what would the U.S. do were a Russian or a Chinese tanker of oil head towards Cuba? I mean, what could we suggest that might happen?
Well, that is probably the next chapter of the story, the next moment of the story. If the U.S. responds to say a Russian tanker, the same way that it did to the tanker carrying not a lot of oil, but some oil from Colombia, we are back in the scenario of the 1962 missile crisis.
Yeah.
Suppose the Russian government decides to send a tanker to Cuba. Will it, having watched or having what just happened with this Colombian fuel, will it send a military escort? Will it be a flotilla, not just a tanker, of Russian destroyers escorting the tanker? And will the U.S. Atlantic Fleet intercept it? Then that becomes a very different story, of which Cuba is a sideshow.
Yeah.
That really is a U.S.-Russian confrontation. We'll see.
Yeah. We throw our hands up and we will see indeed. One thing, I think about, obviously, this one-party regime, 6 decades of being entrenched in society, where the Communist Party and the army at the core of everything that controls Cuba. You kind of read and you feel that maybe, leader Díaz-Canel is somewhat expendable, but the regime is not. Do you feel the same way? If things turn south, he could take the hit?
Right. So it clearly is a very strong state. I mean, by that I really mean not only do police officers give traffic tickets, but they can, as they did in most recently, big time in July 2021, repress. I mean, this is a strong state in many ways, weakened by resources, but still remarkably capable. The regime, the form, the way in which it governs, the tolerance or the acceptance that it may have, or the support that it may have, I think has weakened. And it has weakened in part because the leadership of President Díaz-Canel and Prime Minister Marrero has seemed paralyzed. They did not, the country did not sprint forward once the pandemic abated. The economy has been declining pretty much every year during the entire Díaz-Canel presidency. Díaz-Canel became president in 2018.
Yeah.
By normal standards of political leadership, this is someone, it's very difficult to imagine anybody choosing to vote for re-election.
Yeah.
Now, so one way to think about it is, okay, we're not going to dismantle the state, we're not going to change the regime, but we're going to get rid of the president. That's possible. You could imagine a negotiation where Trump would want to declare victory. Trump will surely want to declare victory in some way or another at some point. And part of the victory would be, hey, I kidnapped Maduro and I got rid of Díaz-Canel, because the Cuban government would go through a procedure Díaz-Canel could resign, the parliament could elect a successor. There is a vice president, but I mean, it would be easier to elect a successor. Cuba is supposed to have a new president in any event in 2028, but that may be too late for President Trump. And so it is possible that among the outcomes of the events that still are unfolding may be a new president of Cuba within the same regime. There are, by the way, a question you did not ask me, but it is related to the question you have asked me. Could the Cuban government change some of the rules of the regime?
Yeah.
So that it is at least a tad less authoritarian? Yes. So I'll give you an example of something that's entirely possible within the Cuban Constitution as it exists. You look at the Cuban electoral law. Cuban electoral law says that for municipal elections, the equivalent of city council, for municipal elections, for every spot, there must be at least 2 candidates. There may be 3 candidates, maybe 4. There must be at least 2. So they mandate inter-candidate competition in a single-party system. For the National Assembly, the National Parliament, the Congress, in the South American or U.S. sense, the same electoral law says 1 spot, 1 and only 1 candidate. They could use the rules in that electoral law at the municipal level and apply them to the national level. To say that for all parliamentary posts, municipal or national, there must be at least 2 candidates, single-party system. So that's within the same regime, single-party system, but now you would have candidate competition.
So things that they could, it would be changing, it wouldn't be changing the rules of the game, but it would be changing them visibly, again, to appear and to act less authoritarian, but at the same time, it could be things that they could switch back once.
Exactly, they could switch back.
So changing things,
You could imagine, and by the way, when the one significant agreement between the U.S. and Cuba took place between President Barack Obama and President Raul Castro. And at that time, they had a formula that I thought was very clever, which is neither side is making a concession to the other.
Yeah.
Each side is proceeding in its own national interest and in its own rules. And it just so happens that at the same moment, each side decided to free prisoners that the other wanted to have freed. Great. It's a wonderful formula. You're not requiring someone to kneel in front of the other one or humiliate in front of the other one. So Cuba, in the context of a negotiation with the United States, it would say, we have now come to the moment of such success in our socialism that we will now mandate candidate competition for the National Assembly. That's not so hard.
No, and of course it feels, as you say, it's no surrender. Again, it's not bowing down.
And to be perfectly frank, it really would be in their national interest if they were to do something like that. By the way, the Cuban. Well, no, I'll let you ask.
No. I wonder though. We have to bring him up as Marco Rubio. Is he open to this kind of negotiation, or is he far more, he needs regime change, let's say? Because a lot of people would say that he's pegging his presidential candidacy hopes on this as well.
Right. So I think Marco Rubio on this question has been very consistent. I'm prepared to believe that this is part of his core political, emotional, intellectual commitment, that he does want regime change in Cuba. It's not clear that Donald Trump cares much about regime change anywhere.
No.
So he is prepared to use the regime change card if it is convenient. He doesn't seem to have a problem with President Putin. He has a bunch of problems with China, but regime change doesn't seem to be in the cards. In Venezuela, most recently, he got a lot of what he wanted, but regime change is not one of them.
No.
So it is possible that you could have Donald Trump saying to Marco Rubio, hey, we're going to get a lot of stuff that we would like. And if it's the same regime with a lot of the same old characters, let's get rid of Díaz-Canel. That's easy. The Cubans don't have any real problem with that.
Yeah.
How about something else? So there have been these mines in eastern Cuba.
Right.
These are rare earths, which is one of the things that Trump is interested in, and indeed, these kinds of minerals really do matter. Before the revolution in the 1950s, they were developed by U.S. companies. They were expropriated. Sherritt International, a Canadian company, has been operating them. Sherritt has just suspended operations because of lack of sufficient energy to run them. There's nothing that prevents the Cuban government to say, okay, Sherritt is not doing this, we'll turn them to U.S. companies, and the U.S. will authorize the necessary fuel to run the mines. Cuba would continue to own the subsoil. Cuba would continue to own the soil, but the operations, why not? It's like a hotel. A hotel, the operator is one company, the owner of the actual building is somebody else. That could be part of a deal as well. And that may be enough for Trump.
Yeah.
It would not be enough for Rubio, but Rubio has not wanted to break with Trump. And that may be part of his presidential aspirations. He needs Trump to be either supportive or at least neutral if it is a confrontation for the Republican Party nomination between Vice President Vance and Marco Rubio.
Yeah, it seems, I just, you obviously, we talk about the U.S. agenda, and then, of course, but it's the suffering of the 10 million people remaining on the island that is obviously the most pressing concern right now. And
now below 10.
Now below 10. Okay.
So many people have left.
So,
the other point on population, Cuba has been below what demographers call the replacement level since 1978. That is to say, not enough kids are being born to replace those who die. So on a natural path, zero immigration, Cuba's population is slowly shrinking.
Sure.
What happened with the last 5 years is that nearly 1.5 million people left. That's why it's now below 10.
Yeah, I mean, let's just say we've seen them here in Colombia. Of course, I spent time up into the Darien area, and almost every other person was either Haitian or Cuban actually coming through. It was quite something.
By the way, it may get worse with this hardship. And if the U.S. blocks migration from Cuba, which presumably it might, then the Cubans choosing to leave the island are going to head for Colombia and other countries.
But I mean, you can't imagine that the U.S. would want this, again, these migrations to take place. You can't imagine, but it's one hand and the other. I keep coming back to this one issue of the repression, and when there was let's say the disturbances and the demonstrations a few years ago. And I read somewhere recently, if oil reserves, and they may run out by mid-March, I think it was someone from a university in Texas who had this statistic.
Yes, right.
This could lead to social unrest. But I mean, as we said, the Cuban regime is so very effective at cracking down on this. But you sort of feel that any cruelty towards Cuba in this way is of benefit to Díaz-Canel, really.
So one of the reasons Díaz-Canel had been losing support, and he really had been losing support, is that every speech began by saying, all the bad things that are happening in Cuba are the fault of policy.
Yeah.
Some of things clearly were caused by the United States, but a lot of what was wrong in Cuba was because he was not taking leadership, he was not enacting changes. changes that Cuban economists have long been telling him to undertake, that the Vietnamese, not just the Chinese, have been telling him to undertake if you want to be a communist regime in the 21st century. So finally, ordinary Cubans could say, it is true that the reason I have to walk 10 kilometers per day is the United States and President Donald Trump. So you could imagine Díaz-Canel saying, hey, gracias, Trump.
It's quite distressing, isn't it? Also, there was a note or an article out in I want to name Axios saying that Marco Rubio is in secret talks with Raul Castro's grandson. Have you heard anything of this? And this bypassing of.
I've read the same story that you indicated. So let me comment in a number of ways. First, the Cuban officials I spoke with during the last several days say clearly, not just in public, but in private, these are people I've known for a while. There are no serious negotiations. It's not to say that there may not have been a meeting, that there may not. The Axios article talks about a discussion about the future. I could imagine perfectly civilized conversations that may have taken place, saying, hey, maybe we'll get together and, have a coffee at some point. All of that, I suspect, happens. Similarly, they have continued to be what are called technical discussions. Every time the U.S. sends an airplane with Cubans deported back to Cuba, you need to negotiate that. There are a number of those things as well. The question here is, the difference between, hey, let's have a coffee at some point and, how's the weather today versus a substantive negotiation. A couple of thoughts. One is invariably the focus, and this is very strong in the Cuban American community in Miami, that anything that happens in Cuba has to be done by someone named Castro. And that was certainly used to be true. It's less true now. Or has to be done by someone whose name is Castro and is in military uniform. That used to be true. It is less true now. It's a more complex regime. The more worrisome aspect of the story is whether this is a deliberate leak, a deliberate plant to say, we, the U.S., are talking to the Cubans.
Yeah.
When in fact it might not be true. Yes, they might have gotten together, but there was not a real negotiation. So that they could then say, few days, few weeks from now, we were negotiating with the Cubans in good faith and the Cubans did not respond. Well, if you don't have a real negotiation to begin with, if all that you have is, hey, nice to see you, let's have coffee someday. And because the Cubans allegedly did not respond seriously, let's turn on the screws some more. That's the worry about I have no doubt that the Axios reporter reported what he read, discussed, and talked, but it's how to interpret it.
Yeah, the information given and how to interpret it. And so we should really wind this down, and Jorge, but how do you feel then, if we could talk about, and this is a massively loaded question to end this on, in Cuba's short-term future, what do you see occurring?
So if I had to choose one word for the days that I was there, it's resilience. It's not surrender. Will this resilience break? Well, it could be. You quoted that report about running out of fuel mid-March. That's Jorge Domínguez. He's a very serious guy.
Yes.
I have very high respect for him. Suppose that happens. Well, however resilient the Cubans may feel, if you don't have any fuel for anything, it really does grind down to zero. Will you have riots in the streets at the time? I don't know. Again, the line between hardship and the collapse of the state is not so clear. In almost any other country, I would have little doubt in affirming that connection. This is the third time Cuba has been in this situation. The last two times, the state did not collapse. The political regime endured. The difference this time is that there's no Fidel Castro.
Yeah.
He was the one who managed the last two. Can Raul Castro, born in 1931 and now really, not very active, and Miguel Díaz-Canel and the others manage this? I don't know. Maybe we have to talk again in a few weeks.
Well, that's the thing. It's moving so fast. It kind of gets the feeling that who's going to blink first,
It could move very quickly.
Yeah, definitely so. And unfortunately, this will go out soon, so we won't have to go back over ourselves. But it is a fascinating situation. It is a concerning situation. A lot to consider. You were just there. You saw it with your own eyes, and I think there's no better way of explaining what's going on. And obviously, your decades of experience on the island, but having been there in the last few days really is something that we don't get. We get analysis and punditry and so on, but to have someone on the ground is very different. So can I take this moment to say thank you so much to Dr. Jorge Domínguez, retired Harvard professor, for sharing his time and really unlimited knowledge on Cuba and the situation taking place there at the moment.
Thank you, Richard.
You're most welcome. I've been Richard McCall, your host here in Bogota, Colombia. Please remember to hit subscribe for the LatinNews Podcast and share it far and wide. We'll be back in a fortnight's time discussing further developments from the region. And goodbye.